People differ in many respects, some important, some trivial. Personality traits are among the individual difference characteristics that are important and powerful in explaining human behavior. We may describe individuals as introverted versus extroverted, hardworking versus lazy, friendly versus hostile, anxious versus relaxed. Research examining how various personality characteristics relate to one another has led to the widely accepted conclusion that they can all be clustered under the umbrella of 5 broad personality dimensions. These 5 broad categories of personality attributes have become known as the Big 5 personality dimensions. The development of the Big 5 is a complicated and interesting process. There isn't one single psychologist who is responsible for the creation of the Big 5. The Big 5 personality dimensions have many fathers. The discovery of the Big 5 can be traced back to Sir Francis Galton, Darwin's half-cousin. In 1884, he proposed the idea that the most important characteristics of individuals are captured in the words that people use to describe each other and thus become embedded in languages around the world. This is referred to as the Lexical Hypothesis. Following his ideas, Baumgarten started the psycholexical study in Germany in 1933. Later, in 1936, Allport and Odbert conducted a seminal lexical study of the personality terms with an English dictionary. They identified almost 18,000 terms. At the time, the staggering size of the list seemed like a semantic nightmare. Allport and Odbert thought that organizing these thousands of personality attributes into satisfactory taxonomy would keep a psychologist at work for a lifetime. Indeed, this task has occupied personality psychologists for more than 60 years. From the 18,000 terms, Allport and Odbert identified 4 major categories. First, personality traits. Second, temporary states, moods, and activities. Third, highly evaluative judgment of personal conduct and reputation. And fourth, physical characteristics, capacities, and talents. In 1967, Norman elaborated Allport and Odbert's initial classification and divided the domains into 7 content categories. Now the individuals can be described by their enduring traits, by their internal states they typically experience, by the physical states they endure, by the activities engaged in, by the effects they have on others, by the roles they play, and by the social evaluation of their conduct. Both Allport and Odbert and Norman run into a problem. An inspection of the classification quickly shows that categories overlap and have fuzzy boundaries, leading some researchers to conclude that distinctions between personality descriptors should be abolished. In contrast, Chaplin, John, and Goldberg proposed a prototype conceptions where each category is defined in terms of its clear cases rather than its boundaries: states, traits, and activities. Although he didn't say much about how to categorize personalities, but he emphasized the conceptual definition of the traits and states. The definitions are still widely used today. Identifying the major dimensions of personality is not easy. The development of the practical taxonomy of the Big 5 started with Cattell. In 1943, he used the Allport and Odbert list as a starting point, then reduced the list to 4,500 trace terms. Although it is a huge reduction, it is still too broad. By using semantic and empirical clustering procedures, Cattell reduced the 4,500 trait terms to 35 variables. Using these small sets of variables, Cattell conducted several factor analysis and concluded that he had identified 12 personality factors, which eventually became part of his 16 personality factors. Cattell's early effort and the availability of a short list of variables stimulated others to examine the structure of the trait rating. The Big 5 finally emerged from decades of evaluation and clarification. First, in 1949, PSYCH constructed much simplified descriptors from 22 of Cattell's variables. The factor structures derived from self-rating, ratings by peers, and ratings by psychological staff members were highly similar. Tupis and Crystal in 1961 reanalyzed correlations matrices from 8 different samples, ranging from airmen with no more than high school education to first-year graduate students, and conclude rating by peers, supervisors, teachers, or experienced clinicians in settings as diverse as military training courses and sorority. In all analyses, Tupis and Crystal found 5 relatively strong and recurrent factors. These 5-factor structures had been replicated by Norman in 1963, Bocata in 1964, and Digman and Katamoto in 1981 in lists derived from Cattell's 35 variables. Following Norman's in 1963, the factors were initially labeled extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and culture. It is easy to understand that emotional stability could later be developed into neuroticism categories, but how did culture end up in one of the categories? As pointed out by Goldberg in 1989, the interpretation of Factor 5 as culture arose from a historical accident. Although Cattell had initially constructed a subset of variables relating to intellect, in the same seminal studies of Cattell in 1947, he omitted all those variables in favor of the intelligence test. In turn, this test was omitted from his later studies, leaving no direct representation of most intellect variables. In their absence, Factor 5 was called culture by Tupis and Crystal in 1961. The variable related to intellect were reintroduced by Goldberg in 1990. However, narrow intellect interpretation led the psychologists to favor the broader openness interpretation proposed by McCrane. The Big Five started out with an idea from Sir Francis Galton, adopted by Baumgarten. Later on, Allport and Odbert start working on identifying adjectives that describe personality. Using factor analysis, Cattell's reduced Allport and Odbert's list from 18,000 to 4,500 to 35 to 16 personality factors. Other psychologists were inspired by Cattell's 35 variable list, and through decades of modification and empirical evaluation, the Big Five was born.